Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to today's editorial webcast, Power Up Your Password Policy. This event is sponsored by Specops and presented by Redmond Magazine. My name is Leif Lowe, and I'll be your moderator today. And I just want to thank you all for joining us. Well, in the Directive Digital Identity Guidelines, SP 800-63, the National Institute of Standards and Technology issued several critical guidelines to help organizations ensure password strength and security. Now, in the most general terms, this NIST advisory wants organizations to shift the burden of proof to the verifying party whenever possible. It has some very detailed recommendations. It advises against enforcing special characters like numbers and explanation points, things like that. And against password hints, like what's the name of your first pet, or what's your mother's maiden name, that sort of thing. And it also advises against organizations requiring random password requirements, expiration requirements rather. Like some companies will require you to change your password every 6 months or something like that. Now, while these guidelines still may hold some validity in this rapidly evolving security landscape, it's critical to apply stronger password policy enforcement. During this editorial webcast today, we'll be exploring the viability of the NIST password framework and provide some updated techniques and tactics for ensuring a rock-solid password policy. During today's webcast, you'll learn more about advanced password enforcement policies, which of the NIST password guidelines are most effective, and some technologies and tactics to help ensure solid password protection. Before we begin, just need to run through a couple of housekeeping items. If you would like to submit a question at any time, which we strongly encourage you to do, just look for the question field to the left of the slide window. Type your question in there and hit submit, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentations. Also wanted to let you know this webcast is being recorded and will be archived for future viewing. Starting tomorrow, you can access the replay using the same link you used today. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's webcast. Well, later in the presentation, we'll be hearing from Liz Rivera, who is the Product Marketing Manager for Specops Software. Liz has been working in the software industry, delivering market-oriented solutions to IT professionals for the past 14 years. Our featured speaker today is Nick Cavalancia. Nick has more than 25 years of enterprise IT experience. He's an accomplished consultant, speaker, trainer, writer, and columnist. Nick has earned many certifications, including the MCSE, MCT, Master CNE, Master CNI, and Microsoft MVP certifications. He has authored, co-authored, and contributed to nearly 24 books on various technology topics. And he's a regular speaker, writer, and blogger for some of the most recognized tech companies. You can follow him in either of those Twitter handles listed there on the bio slide. Thanks again for joining us today, Nick.
It's always a pleasure, Leif. Thanks for having
me. Indeed. Well, today Nick and I will be discussing these NIST recommendations for password strength, whether those recommendations remain sufficient, and what you can do to ensure you have a powerful password policy. Well, thanks again for joining us today. And now, Nick, let's begin our exploration of these NIST recommendations. Now, again, the basic message from that NIST directory was, to have longer passwords, to not require using these special characters or those secret questions, and it also advises against required expiration dates. So let's take a look at some of those recommendations individually.
Sure.
Now, Nick, in your experience, do you think the length requirement of a password anywhere between 8 to 64 characters is sufficient? And what about the special requiring the special characters? What's your feeling on that?
It's a Good question. The simple answer, I think that everybody already knows in the audience, but I'm just going to make sure we put it out there and we level set everybody, is the longer the password, the harder it is to crack it. And if we're talking about purely protecting against password cracking, then certainly longer passwords are going to be more secure. The issue around things like special characters and having difficulty remembering them. One of the things that I tend to recommend, especially even let's say my mom, someone who's got to come up with a password, she's in her 70s, she's not going to remember, lowercase q, #3, exclamation point. I mean, it's not going to get that, right? And so instead, I'm actually a very big fan of grammatically correct English sentences. English is, if you have a different language, your own language, insert there. But I'll give you an example. So if I had a sentence that was written grammatically correct and followed, proper English standards, it said the number one runner wasn't the slowest. So there's a capital T at the beginning, there's a period at the end, there's an apostrophe and wasn't, and let's say number one was a £, and the actual number 1. Then when I've got that kind of a sentence in there, I went and ran that through a website that tells you how long it'll take to crack a password, and it was several millennia.
Oh, wow.
Which I don't know if it's exactly accurate, but my point being, it's going to take a really long time with 2020 or 2019 standards in terms of how fast we can process. I think it's something like 17 million passwords a second, something along those lines. So having a password like that is actually sufficiently correct, secure. The issue becomes, and I think the reason why the requirements are talking about maybe not using those, and you've kind of talked about it a little bit, is that people won't remember them, especially when it's. I mean, we've seen those recommendations for IT pros, and it's use those # lowercase q, uppercase A, 1, 7, sign, because we can sort of either remember it or have it in a vault or something or other. But for everyday users, it's really tough.
And the harder it is to remember, the more likely it is they're going to write it down somewhere, which of course is like leaving out the keys to the kingdom.
You post it on the monitor. Yes, exactly.
Yep. Yikes. All right. Well, that sort of segues nicely into the next question, what you were talking about using a full sentence there. Do you think a longer individual password is sufficient, or using some kind of passphrase or sentence, like you say?
Okay, so what's interesting here is if you look at the guidelines and read through it, I think the answer kind of lies in looking at not just moving from a password to a passphrase, which I'm a big proponent for. I think it helps solve some of the issues. People can memorize a sentence, this is the most secure password I've ever written, period, or something, that kind of thing, the passphrase. But then also looking at, there are inside the 800-63, there are some very specific authentication assurance levels. And there's basically 3 levels that are kind of guidelines around what should be used, and there's a ramification when it comes to passwords, and it kind of gives you some idea of what you should and shouldn't be using. And just to kind of run through these real quick, AAL, or Authenticator Assurance Level 1, so AAL1 provides, according to the NIST guidelines, they call it some assurance. There's actually some, and then high, and then very high. Kind of as the idea as you go through the levels. And level 1 basically is using either single factor or multi-factor. There is a wide range of authentication solutions or technologies, rather, that can be used. And it does include things like what they would call a memorized secret. That's a passphrase or a password. On those lines, can be looked at, that kind of thing. Even the questions that get asked, that sort of thing. Level 2 wants to have 2 distinct factors, and they can use either multi-factor or a combination of 2 single-factor authentications. But interestingly enough, if you're using 2 single-factor authentications, you need to use a memorized secret authentication and one that's possession-based. Basically back to the something you know and something you have. So we're still talking password, passphrases here. And then when you get to assurance level 3, it says that you've got to use a hardware-based authenticator that basically provides verifier impersonation resistance. That's a fancy way of saying somebody can't pretend to be you, and they can't replay the log-on transaction, as it were, after the fact. So in that case, passwords kind of come out, but what I want to make sure you guys in the audience understand is 1, 2, and 3 don't necessarily mean like the person in the mailroom should be 1 and the CEO should be 3. It really depends on where you're at in the industry, how much security is really required for the data that you're housing in your environment, and so on. But as you can tell from assurance levels 1 and 2, passwords still come into play, and then passphrases still also kind of have a value here. And so I think the reality is you've got to think about the necessity for the security, and you start thinking about it for each role within the organization. And you look at those authentication assurance levels as kind of a starting point to figure out whether or not, and this is a long-winded answer to come back to what you talked about here and then what you've got on the screen, which is whether we're using passwords/passphrases or are we not. And for most of you, you're probably still going to utilize a passphrase to some degree. It's going to be a passphrase is going to always be used in some cases. So I'm a big proponent for passphrases. From the NIST standard perspective, it's still something that's very much going to be used. They're not against it. They're just looking for increasing ways to ensure that it's definitely you and that someone can't pretend to be you. And given the given the fact that the bad guys today are doing a lot of social engineering to try and passwords from people and trick them into, hey, your passwords need to be reset. Click on this page, and it looks just like, let's say, Office 365's log on. Right. You got to be thinking about something beyond, but definitely be thinking about having as secure a password as you can from a kind of a cracking perspective.
Right. And hopefully, again, something that you'll remember, so you don't have to, do something crazy like write it down or something like that. Yeah, and that was interesting. Your point about the the CEO and the mailroom clerk should have equally strong passwords. That's a good point, because certainly, I mean, you're talking about social engineering. If the bad guys know that the lower on the totem pole you are, the less secure you are, that's where they're going to go. For sure.
Well, there's going to be varying levels of degrees for sure, but it's important to consider that even the mailroom clerk needs to have some kind of degree of secure password. There are, for example, there's RDP attacks that go on today where they'll try and literally hit an RDP session that's accessible from the outside, and they'll try every account name they can think of, and they'll try, let's say, they'll start with the A's, and they'll have Amy, and they'll log in as Amy, and they'll try a million passwords. They'll try Amy A and a million passwords, Amy B, a million passwords. And if they can get access even to the mailroom clerk, that's all that's needed, because once we can get in as even a low-level person, as a hacker, if I can gain access to your email, and then I can send and download maybe a piece of malware or a link to a piece of malware, send an email out to everybody in the organization or some specific people in the organization that have higher-level privileges than I do, I being the mailroom clerk. Those are the kinds of things that all it takes in order to start giving an external attacker a real good, solid foothold and access to elevated credentials.
Yep, just getting a foot in the door, that's for sure. For sure. All right. Now, one of the other recommendations is recommending actually against the fairly common practice of requiring a password reset every so often, like every 6 months or every year or something like that. Do you think that's a beneficial recommendation?
So I think the requirement, you even kind of hinted at this in your opening statement. In reality, if it was just purely up to the security folks on the call here today, all of you would probably say, everyone's going to change their password and you're going to insert whatever time frame. Those of you that are very much against risk, you're going to say like every week, every day, once a month, once a quarter, once every 6, right? But we all know what's going to happen. It's going to be a basic password or passphrase, and then the number 1 at the end, and then the number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's all they're going to do. It's not really any more secure, and that becomes really the problem here. And so if we're using, even let's say some basic form of single or multi-factor authentication, whether it's 2-factor or multiple factors, as the case would be, there's still some degree of password reset necessary. And I'll just kind of give you an example of what the bad guys will do. If they can gain access to an endpoint and it has elevated admin permissions on the endpoint. So if you've got a user who's given admin rights to the endpoint itself, or they can try to find an account that has admin rights and guess some passwords, which again comes back to the idea of having complex passwords. Once they can finally get elevated permissions on an endpoint, they're going to utilize either you can get a command line version of this. It's a tool called Mimikatz, M-I-M-I-K-A-T-Z. For those of you listening, or there's also JavaScript that does this and so on. And the idea is it'll scrape RAM and it'll find clear text passwords, password hashes, which can be used in a pass the hash attack. It'll find Kerberos tickets, which you can use the rainbow tables to try and crack those. I mean, the idea is that they're going to take additional steps. Once they have one set of credentials, they're going to take additional steps to try and get more credentials. 60% of all attacks involve lateral movement, that's across the board. So it's important all along that every user, even like the local admin account, anyone that has admin rights on a local machine, that kind of thing, that there are secure passwords, because the idea of password cracking is still going to kind of come into play in some shape or another in an attack.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and like you said, that lateral.
Oh, one other thing I want to mention.
Sure.
The elevated accounts. I definitely am a big proponent.
IT managers and things like that.
It could be domain admins or admins, or you got on the call. You have to set the bar yourself. You have to define from this level up in terms of what they have access to that's sensitive in your environment. I'm a very big fan of the rotation of more frequently of those kinds of passwords. Up to and including, depending on the level of account, and this is obviously at the high end or the one end of the spectrum, is literally with every use. Go back to the Mimikatz example. If I can scrape RAM and see what a password is for, let's say, the domain admin account that happened to log onto a given endpoint, and that's the one that I, as a hacker, happen to break into and commandeer, well, now I've got your domain admin credentials. So that involves a bit more technology in place, but that's sort of a recommendation you guys should be thinking about, that is on that one end of the spectrum, as frequent as is possible.
Yeah, good point indeed. All right. Well, one of the other recommendations NIST makes is recommends against using these so-called secret questions that we've talked a little bit about, to further verify your identity. Things like, what was the name of your first dog, or where'd you go to grammar school, or your mother's maiden name, that sort of thing. I mean, those certainly are are factoids that could easily be gleaned by a skilled social engineer. What do you think of those types of questions? You did mention a little bit the deeper secrets, like something that truly that only the person would know.
So memorized secrets is the way that NIST calls it in the document, and they are allowed in the authenticator assurance levels 1 and 2, but not in 3. And you're absolutely right. I mean, the Facebook did away with what's your mom's maiden name. That's just dead for at least half the population, right? Because every woman puts their maiden name, for whatever reason. And I mean, I even remember seeing a meme this week where it was like a Tinder conversation, and it's basically some guy that all he does is like, hey, so what was your first dog's name? Hey, what school did you go to? It's like, it's stuff that can be easily found out. So that's all dead. So the memorized secrets can definitely be of value, and I agree with the recommendation from the standpoint of let's not use the really easy ones. You've got a couple of them that are up there, but if it was something more like, for example, what was your favorite toy as a child? That's something that no one's going to know. You haven't posted that on Facebook ever. I mean, I doubt it. Or what's your most prized possession? I mean, something that's very, very specific, very unique, not something that would be normally shared out. That sort of thing. And then I think that also the value is found in how unique they are, and then secondly, the requirement to probably provide more than one, the answer to more than one question. So that way, it's definitely, it's not, who is your favorite actor on TV? That's pretty, really specific that you may never tell anyone, or whatever, but that kind of thing. And I think back to if you've ever done this, like when you try to get a mortgage or a loan, sometimes they'll verify that it's you by asking very specific questions about your life's history. And it's like from 1993 to 1997, which of these loans did you have open, right? Now, that's very loan strict, and we're not going to use that in the corporate world. But my point is, those are so specific. From 1993 to 1995, which of these did you have? If you're not going to know that. That's not something you can easily figure out. And so it's the same kind of level. How do we do this in a way where we're asking questions that somebody would not, only the person that knows the answers, the authenticator, the person who holds a credential actually would know the answer.
Yeah, something truly unique to them, and something that's probably a little safer from social engineering type of attacks, I would imagine.
Right.
Yeah. All right. Okay. Well, thinking of passwords and phrases and complete sentences and all that, are passwords in these longer phrases by themselves, are they still sufficient from a security perspective, or do you think that should be part of some sort of two-factor authentication?
Okay, good question. So remember, going back to the AALs that I covered, one includes memorized secrets. Go ahead. Level 2 says if you're going to use 2 single-factor authentications, a memorized secret, meaning a password or passphrase, should be one of them. So even the NIST guidelines are telling you guys in the audience, a password's still good. Level 3, that's very, very secure environment, government, contractors, or something that's really secure, or you have a lot of data that you really want to protect, or for a particular subset of users. So it's definitely part of that. And as you can see, even by looking at the NIST guidelines, the stuff that I've kind of covered, passwords and passphrases have a role even in the idea of having two-factor. And I'm a big fan of having two-factor authentication as a bare bones minimum for any organization, for any user, from the mailroom up to the CEO. That's sort of my thinking here. But again, the passwords and passphrases do come into play there. And one of the reasons the two-factor comes into play is something like, again, let's say you're logging in. I mentioned the Office 365 example a while back. And with Office 365, if someone says, "Hey, your password is expired, please reset it," and then they trick you into providing your password, well, that's great. They got the password, but if you have two-factor authentication, then you're still secure because they're not going to have that extra factor. Although things like today, I've seen Google 2FA broken. I've seen people, and you've probably heard some of this, you guys in the audience. You've heard of like cell phones being reassigned to a different SIM, and then that way they actually stole the phone and get the second factor, which is like a text message and that kind of thing. I mean, there's lots of examples of people breaking factors. So you got to be careful. There's nothing that's perfect, but the short answer to this question on the screen here is, yes, they're still sufficient. They still play a role, but the trick here is to make sure that you've got them at appropriate levels of complexity, frequency of being changed, that kind of thing, and then using it as part of, for at least some, if not all of the users, some form of multi-factor authentication, whether it's 2 or more.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, they're still certainly going to be part of the equation. That's why we're here talking about it. It definitely has to be part of a strong framework for sure.
Agreed.
All right. Now moving in toward the admin side, which probably affects a lot of the folks in the audience. On the admin side, what are some of the best practices for an organization for storing and managing passwords to truly ensure their security?
Excel spreadsheets. I'm just kidding.
Not Excel spreadsheets.
No, exactly. That and Post-its. That's all you need. Right. Big stack of Post-its. You guys are good. I'm a big fan of. Some of you are like, "What's wrong with that?" That's what I do. I know that's what you do. So you got to do what you got to do. I get it. But. I'm a big fan of privileged access management, sometimes just called PAM, those kinds of solutions. And in essence, for you guys in the audience that may not be familiar with it, and those that are, bear with me for a second. I just want to kind of level set for everyone. The idea behind PAM is essentially having a vault type of application that takes privileged passwords. And what's a privileged password, Nick? Domain admin rights, any kind of OU admin type of rights. Application-specific, data-specific, role-specific. You have to define kind of where the line gets drawn of what is, I'm doing air quotes here in my office, privileged. what is an admin? I'm doing, again, air quotes here in my office. What is an admin and what has at that elevated level? So you have to define that. But in this case, you're putting all of those passwords into this vault, and somebody logs in with a low-level account. So even you guys in the audience, you would log in with a low-level personal account, and then you would go and check out the admin account. And that way there's an audit trail of who's utilized it, who's logged it out, you use it, and then you check it back in when you're done, that sort of thing. And there should be a couple of feature sets that I like to see in them, things like where I lost my train of thought here. Oh, so it would have at least something like having password rotation in place, meaning when you check the password back in, it automatically changes. And it changes on with the directory as well and in the vault, that kind of thing. Some kind of workflow or approval should be there for at least some passwords. Like someone wants to check out the domain admin, they mean the domain admin. Maybe someone has to approve that first, or at least be notified, that kind of thing. And then the last part here is that, again, having that audit trail. There's at least a way for us to tell that Bob checked out the admin account for the SQL server or whatever, and at least now we have some form, if not something greater than that. And then the thing here, though, to consider is while it's really important to what you've got on the screen here, the admin side, remember, you guys in the audience, that there are a ton more non-admins in the org. And it does take that one low-level user. I use the example of the mailroom person. They get compromised. The email gets sent with a piece of malware attached. I mean, it only takes one person that's a low level. So, so you've got to be thinking about, you got to think about what to do with privileged accounts and admin accounts, but you also have to be thinking about everyone else as well.
Yep. Yeah, those are definitely some good recommendations on the admin, that kind of revolving single-use passwords and notifications and that sort of thing. Yeah, probably not a bad idea to have two people be able to authorize that too, or requiring two people to authorize something.
Missile keys kind of a thing?
What's that?
Are you thinking like two missile keys kind of a thing? Two people have to...
Exactly. Yep.
Could very well be part of it. I was sort of thinking of like the bare bones minimum of stuff that I definitely would want to see in a solution like that. But again, for the remainder of the folks that are in the organization that are not going to be inside a PAM solution, then we kind of go back to things we've talked about before, having the secure passwords, be thinking about an appropriate level of frequency, that sort of thing as well. Yeah. For rotation.
Yep, absolutely. And two missile keys, that's a good metaphor. All right. Well, beyond some of these guidelines that we've been discussing and some of the things that are posted in that NIST directive, do you have any other guidelines or recommendations to help organizations establish a more secure password policy?
Sure. I think the first thing, and this is something that if you've done any kind of establishing of security plans of any kind, this has got to be risk-driven. So you've got to think about different requirements for different levels, different roles within the organization is a good way to do this. I would probably start by having a minimum minimum secure password posture, meaning this is the minimum we're going to have. We're at least going to have, I'm making this up as I go along, so I'm not saying I'm recommending this, but just as an example, it's going to be a minimum of 8 characters. It's going to have some X degree of complexity. It's going to have to change Y number of days, but you come up with that's the basics. Everyone's there, and it only gets more stringent from there, if you were. And so... it can be more complex. It can be more frequent password resets. It could be additional authentication factors. It just sort of depends, but I would start by defining roles within the org rather than looking at specific people. I would probably start with roles like departments, and if within departments, if there's different levels of access in the departments, maybe you divide those down. But you try to come up with some levels of roles so you're not having 370 different policies. You have maybe 20 different policies. I'm, again, making up numbers, but that's kind of the intent. And you think about it in terms of having access to sensitive or critical data, and then you set the minimum password policy, apply it to the lowest level, and then you figure out how you can balance sort of user productivity with a more the idea being security and productivity kind of balance one another. So if I'm going to put a more stringent policy in place that requires an 82-character password, and it must contain, then if that's the case, you got to find a balance there between users going, forget this, I'm just going to quit my job. It's a whole lot easier than trying to remember what my password is. So it's security and productivity, but in the essence, you're still figuring out what your bare bones minimum security requirement is from a password policy perspective, and then increasing it, whether it's again complexity, reset frequency, length, or if it involves other authentication factors.
All right, sounds good. Well, thank you very much, Nick. Those are some great insights. Some good things to think about for sure.
It's always an honor, Leif.
Indeed. And now I'd like to introduce Liz Rivera from Specops to hear some of their recommendations on ensuring password strength. Take it away, Liz.
Great, thanks, guys. Hi, everybody. So as Leif said, I'm Liz Rivera, representing here Specops Software. Specops Software has actually been developing simple Active Directory integrated solutions for over 18 years. We offer two main product portfolios that focus on both security and efficiency. Our authentication and password management portfolio can address everything from meeting audit requirements to reducing help desk password reset calls to even securing the Office 365 login with multi-factor authentication. And our desktop management portfolio maximizes efficiency by automating application and OS deployments to users' machines. We have over 5,000 customers across 50 countries, and many of whom are actually password management customers. And as such, we really get firsthand insight into what organizations are really doing as it relates to passwords. So basically, passwords are here to stay. They really remain the #1 form of authentication, although we've been talking about and hearing about their demise for years. This is really due to the fact that passwords are supported by all systems, whereas alternate forms of authentication do not always necessarily lend themselves easily to all use cases or are supported by all systems. This reality really creates a security issue, as you guys all aware. These are some of the reasons why NIST comes up with guidelines and why we're actually on this webinar. But because of this reality, the real gist of it is that the passwords really rely on users making good decisions, right? And the fact of the matter is that most users are just not really security aware. It's not their job to be, right? And this is all aggravated by the fact that all of us have so many passwords to recall. It's not like, we're just accessing applications for work purposes, but, we are also online, for personal reasons. And so this means we have a lot of different accounts. And, this leads to us, kind of falling back to some poor password construction habits. And this is really, in essence, to remember our passwords. So what this results in is us reusing passwords across various applications and systems. And really, this is kind of aggravated, not kind of, but is aggravated by the fact that, many organizations are utilizing single sign-on to kind of say, okay, you can use, single password to access many different systems. So you're using that one password, but at the end of the day, if that password is breached, then an attacker can get into the corporate network rather easily. Also, as NIST points out, users circumvent password rules during password change. Nick did discuss this earlier. Because what users do, when they are changing their password, they don't really change the password. What they do is kind of fall back to that insecure behavior by not changing that base password, but rather, adding characters to the end of the password, as Nick was saying, the password, let's just say it's password, and then they would say, okay, now my new password is password 1. My next password is going to be password 1 too. Obviously, the example password 1 is horrible, but you get my point. And of course, there isn't a lack of password-related attacks that take advantage of this type of behavior. So in fact, today, it is said that there are over 1 billion passwords available on the dark web. And, attackers utilize stolen credentials. They are the #1 attack source. Another interesting thing here is that, password phishing attacks are a primary method utilized by attackers. So, they use the password phishing to get the stolen credential, and then we'll, have at it. And password phishing is actually something that has been around for a while. I think we've all kind of seen those emails that kind of look and feel like, it's coming from a legit source where it's not, or at least we've heard of this happening. So it's a really a tried and true method, and it's been utilized for a long time. However, it still has a very high success rate. To me, I think that this all points to the need that users need to be educated on password security, not just once, but multiple times throughout the year. But also, organizations really need to start looking at implementing smarter, more user-friendly password policies that really do not open up organizations to additional security risks. So, kind of taking a step back, adhering to NIST guidelines as a starting point is good practice. But, I think we all need to be honest that, guidelines are guidelines, and there isn't anything that's like a catch-all. One size does not fit all, and I think that this is the point that Nick was trying to make. Organizations do need to look at varying security levels across the organization to address different user security levels or different user constituencies within the organization. So we do believe that you need to establish a secure baseline for all user groups, as attackers do go after low-level accounts, and then they manipulate that to work their way horizontally. So with that being said, as Nick was pointing out, it is a fact that longer passwords, including passphrases, or including passwords that leverage complexity, are obviously harder to crack in a brute force attack. And obviously this really just boils down to math due to the number of iterations an attacker will have to try, right? But it is obviously also proven that too much complexity can result in users making poor password decisions. So if your organization is regulated, like for example by PCI calls for password complexity. So we really suggest that you look for solutions that can block users from circumventing password rules. You have to abide by regulation. You have to utilize complexities to make sure that your users are not able to fall back on those poor password construction behavior. Or, whether you're regulated or not, you can instead implement passphrases. As Nick was saying, you can make them quite memorable, right? It's easier for the mind to recall. Passphrases can really strike a good balance between security and usability. They're commonly enforced to be longer than 24 characters, and they can be made to be memorable. If you guys recall, like a couple of years ago, the passphrase example kind of circulated on the internet with the horse and the battery with the staple in it. So the passphrase itself was correct horse battery staple. And this specific example had about 44 bits of entropy, or what is known as randomness. And it was said that to crack that specific passphrase, it would take 550 years. So it really increases the security level associated with guessing, right? And as it relates to password expiry, most IT departments really do not know that they have been breached for close to 200 days, and this is according to a statistic from the Ponemon Institute. So really, password expiry provides a means to stop an attacker from continuing to exploit a hacked account. But of course, again, it is proven that expiring passwords too frequently can have a negative effect on users. But really, getting rid of it altogether can leave an organization exposed. In addition, expiry is still required by the likes of PCI as an example. They dictate that the password be changed every 90 days. But even with that being said, there is really a way around, not making it too stringent on users. For example, if a user is required to set a password that is 12 characters in length, but the user sets a 14-character password, you should look to a solution that can actually extend that expiry deadline. So if a user were to show that they have, better security behavior, then reward them with, okay, the expiry set for everybody is 90 days, but if you exceed, the the rule, then of course we can add some more days. So let's say if the character minimum was 12, the end user sets 14-character password, then it increases from 90 days to 112. And this obviously would promote better user security behavior. But with that being said, to my next point, even if a user creates a great strong password or passphrase, that password or passphrase is rendered useless if it were to be leaked. It's now weak. So if your organization, and I'm assuming that it's 100% of the folks on this call, if you guys are relying on passwords within your organization, it's really imperative to look for a solution that can allow you to blacklist leaked passwords. Essentially, as I said before, compromised credentials are the number one source of attacks. And of course, if you're looking at such a solution, you should really be looking at a solution that ensures that it is continuously updated, so it's covering the most recent leaks. And if you also look at NIST and follow the NIST guidelines, NIST actually calls for the blocking of all leaked passwords, so this would be in accordance to what they're stating. The last thing here relates to MFA. And to my earlier point, password phishing is still a very successful attack method. So organizations should be looking to protect use cases where this method, where the password phishing method is utilized. So what typically an attacker would do with a compromised password is the next step is typically to try to reset that password, whether it's via self-service or by calling the help desk. When those two use cases are not utilized, their success rate is pretty much guaranteed. So it is imperative that you look for something, a solution that would provide MFA to secure, those high-risk use cases. And better yet, if the solution were able to utilize existing MFA, so if you're utilizing some form of stronger authentication within your organization to secure a system, you should look for solutions that actually can extend the value of that current asset to these two high-risk use cases. So how can Specops help you out? Specops password solutions can really uplift security with products that address the full scope of password security. Just kind of starting off with our Specops Password Auditor tool. This is actually a free tool that we offer. It takes about 1 minute to download. And you could start here to really get a good overview of the overall security state of your environment. The solution scans Active Directory, and it delivers a graphical view, including downloadable reports that can identify stale admin accounts, accounts of expired passwords, or accounts with weak or non-compliant passwords by comparing existing password policies against NIST, PCI, and other standards. And once you have this insight in hand, you can actually take action, do something about it with Specops Password Policy. This solution actually allows you to create smarter password rules that balance both usability and security. By blocking the use of, predictable patterns like users using incremental characters at the end of passwords, like, the example me and Nick gave, using 1, then 1, 2, then 1, 2, 3. Also, it blocks the use of users using keyboard patterns like the well-known one, QWERTY. And of course, what is known as least speak or common character substitution. So it's not good enough to change a core password by replacing letters with common character substitutions, like replacing S's with $signs. Hackers know that trick. You can also use password policy to create custom dictionary lists. This is important because, those blacklists out there typically will not cover essentially like your company's name and things like that. So, utilizing a custom blacklist is always best practice. And then on top of this, you can utilize the Specops Blacklist service to block the use of over 1 billion leaked passwords. This list is hosted and it's continuously updated. And currently, it is a combination of various leaked lists that include the haven't been pwned, the collection 1 list, and many, many more. Finally, you can utilize Specops Reset to ensure that when users are changing their passwords, or if they're calling the help desk to assist them in a password reset, that those 2 use cases are protected with stronger forms of multi-factor authentication. The solution actually, the MF8 engine within the solution contains over 15 different authentication methods, and then this also includes third-party ones like Semantic VIP and Duo Security. So if you have those assets in place, you can actually extend them to secure those 2 use cases. So with that being said, Leif, I'll turn it over to you, I guess, to open it up to Q&A.
All right. Thank you very much, Liz. Those are some great insights you had as well. You two have certainly it's been a good reminder for me, my own password policies, to be a little more solid about that. Just want to quickly, before we get into the audience questions, we've got some great questions already. Just want to quickly remind everyone there is still time. If you'd like to submit a question, just look for the question field to the left of the slide window. Type your question in there and hit submit, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. And Nick and Liz, I want to give you both an opportunity to chime in on these answers. I'll address them both to you. Starting off with you, Nick. The first question here: what do you think about companies paying for a password vault for their employees to use?
And it helps to not be on mute. Okay, so I that's probably a necessary thing in some cases, because you're talking about. I've not met a company yet that's built one themselves. Have one that's truly secure. Where you've got it at least 256-bit AES encrypted. If not, it's up to was it 440 something blowfish? I forget what the number is at the end, but that kind of thing. So you've got to have something that's encrypted and is secure and can't be broken if you're going to put all your eggs in that basket. So I think for the most part, you're probably looking at needing to spend some dollars. I don't know if that's a full-on. There's PAM, and then there's privileged session management on top of that, and then people sometimes they turn that into multi-factor authentication, identity and access management. All kinds of other factors. If we're just talking about a vault, I don't think it's that expensive.
Yeah. Liz, do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think just to reiterate Nick's first point, I think you really need to evaluate the security level of the solution. Because if you do go down that direction, it is kind of putting all your eggs in one basket. So essentially, you're providing via one key, multiple keys. So that would just be my 2 cents on that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. And again, next question, starting with you, Liz. If the recommendation is to not change passwords, how would you deal with users using their corporate passwords on non-corporate sites that might be obviously less secure?
Well, my recommendation is that you should definitely have password expiry. And you can relax it to a certain extent when it relates to a better user security behavior. So, like I gave the example, if a user is exceeding your base policies, then you can reward them by extending the expiry. But I believe that you should always have expiry in place to kind of put a stop to that hole if in the event that the user's account is breached, because you never know if a user is reusing. It's kind of out of your hands.
Once they're on the internet, they can be going anywhere. That's for sure.
Exactly.
Nick, did you have anything you wanted to add?
There's some good data around this. Ponymon did a 2019 State of Password and Authentication Security Behaviors Report, and 1,300 IT pros, 51% of them reused the same password across an average of, I think it was 5 business and or personal accounts. So, by a show of hands, all of you in the audience, how many of you have done it? I'm going to guess that half of you, if you're raising your hands right now. And what's interesting is this corroborates. LastPass did a study in 2018, and they found that 50% of users were using the same password, and the way that they clarified it was for work and personal accounts. So it's a bit of both. It's definitely an issue, and one of the challenges here for you guys, specifically in the audience, that where you have access, more than likely you're probably not doing separate low-level accounts and elevated accounts and checking them in and out of a password vault and that kind of thing. So your account has some level of elevated permissions. And you think about it, if you've got the same passwords, if they can get access to and fool you into giving up your LinkedIn password, I'm making this all up as I go along, but if they can do that, there's a potential that they can leverage that same set of credential and try to log on locally, and it's providing they can get access to your machine. And if you're thinking, how are they going to find me? They target these days. They are literally targeting down by industry. They're doing it by company. They're doing it by role. They're even doing it by person, and I have a personal experience. I'll give you the abbreviated version, not password related, but just you can see they're targeting an individual. Have an intern. I have another company that's an ebook publisher, and I have a woman that marked herself on LinkedIn as being an intern there because she's sort of a contractor and kind of helping us out. Someone found her on LinkedIn, found the intern, and did, if you've ever read about this, the CEO gift card phishing scam, where they pretend to be me and say, hey, I need you to buy $14 billion in gift cards. And she did. This 23-year-old woman spent $3,000 of her own money and got scammed into buying gift cards and ran all over town to buy stuff that I never asked for. So I'm trying to forewarn you guys that they're targeting literally down to the individual. So even your personal passwords, if they're tied back and they're the same ones as your corporate password, that needs to be kind of falling into the fold here about when you're thinking about what am I supposed to be doing when it comes to password complexity and resetting and how it's managed and policies and all that.
Yeah. Boy, that's a chilling example of what the damage that can be done for sure. Oof. All right, got another question here about, we'll start with you, Nick. What about password security using the cloud? What are some of the trends in this area versus, as opposed to using a VPN?
So I'm not certain I understand what they mean by password security using the cloud. If we're talking about using the cloud as a vault, I see that's being asked by Robin. Robin, could you maybe clarify? You talk about using it as a vault, or you're just talking about password security when we're talking about using cloud-based apps? I think that's what you mean when I'm tying in the VPN. But would you just clarify, and we'll be sure to answer your question, if you wouldn't mind?
We can certainly circle back to that one. So, okay. Now, starting with you, Liz, got another question here. We'd like to incorporate some of these recommendations, such as removing security questions and blacklisting bad passwords, but are concerned about usability. Would you suggest rolling out these changes in stages or all at once?
So I think as it relates to password management, when we think about the security questions, it's typically related to the self-service password reset component. And then when you're talking about complexity, it's related to like password policy, right? These usually are two separate solutions. What we typically see with our customer base is that, and this is what we recommend, because when you implement like a password policy solution to uplift like password complexity or make some changes to password rules within your organization, no matter how easy and how much user training you provide, there is going to be an uptick in calls to the help desk because you're introducing a change. So what we recommend is actually like implementing the two things together to offset the load on the help desk. So when you're introducing a policy solution, you should also introduce like a self-service reset solution. And then within that self-service reset solution, it would be my recommendation to move away, from security questions and look to implement something that is a little bit easier for the user to enroll with, because if you're thinking about enrollment, that's required, right? You have to enroll your answers. And when it comes to password reset, yes, you can make the questions, like Nick had said, a little bit more secure, and it could be like something more memorable. But at the end of the day, it's something that you're not typically doing, every day, hopefully.
Right.
So it's something that's on average done probably like twice a year. So people tend to forget those answers. So it's great if you can, roll this out with, alternate forms of authentication that are secure, but also not so taxing on the user. So things that, can utilize things that already exist in your Active Directory environment, like mobile number for mobile verification verification, although one could argue that that is not like, ultra secure, but it is obviously a level above security questions.
Yeah. Okay. Nick, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I do. I actually love, Liz, the fact that you mentioned the word enrollment. For those of you in the audience that have done any kind of major implementation that touches a user, we all know that adoption makes or breaks a new platform. Like, no one's going to use it. Well, then you could have spent all the money in the world and paid, engineers at $370 an hour for 7 months to be on site doing whatever. If no one uses it, no one uses it. And the question you asked was more about, you do this as kind of a rolled out thing. And I think that Liz's answer is actually more spot on. Sure, yeah, you can do it in stages if you want, or maybe do it all at once. So I think it really comes down to how easy is it to have the users adopt the solution in question. Right. And then you decide whether or not, this is going to be kind of complex, and the help desk is going to get a lot of calls, so maybe we should roll this out in stages and do it by location or by department or by whatever. And I think you've got to look at sort of it comes on a basis of the solution you're putting in place. And Liz, would you kind of agree?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. Okay. So it's kind of a situational approach,
Agreed. Yeah.
Situation. Then Okay. All right. Probably got time for. We haven't heard back from Robin yet, but probably have time for one more quick question before we move into our final thoughts here. I'll start with you, Liz. When passwords are included as part of a two-factor authentication, is it okay to relax on the password complexity requirements in that situation?
I think it really depends on what the other factor is, right? So I think we kind of had some back and forth about security questions and how you can make them more secure. But, at the end of the day, most systems offer the canned ones. If you go the custom route, you could, or you can even go the custom route and allow users to answer their own questions. But obviously that can be unsecure. So, again, it really depends on what that second factor is, because the first factor is going to be the password. So if you're relaxing complexity settings and it's super easy, then it's really you only have one factor. Yeah. So that secondary one better be like really secure.
Really solid. Yeah, got it.
Yeah.
Got it. Nick, any thoughts on that?
I'd actually agree with pretty much what Liz said. It comes down to the complexity comes down to the additional factors, and in some cases, one could even see if you had the right kind of multi-factor authentication in place, you may not actually need passwords. You use biometrics or something else, something else that comes into. But I wouldn't necessarily lax. I think it's more of you're trying to add security onto security. So as long as that I think you started by saying, should we lax the security as part of the question? So that implies there's an existing sort of non-laxed level of security. So let's just call that the standard for the sake of argument. If that's the standard of security, your multi-factor should be adding to that standard, not allowing you to detract, unless that standard is one where it's actually causing an issue for users where they don't want to use it, and it's lowering their productivity, it's lessening adoption, those kinds of things. You're getting pushback.
Gotcha. All right. Well, that's about all the time we have for questions today. Any final thoughts on password security? Any one last thing you want to leave the audience with? Start with you, Liz.
I think that, again, we can sit here and talk about guidelines and passwords and making them more complex, but I really want to stress the fact that, you can have all of these rules in place, but at the end of the day, we know that users reuse passwords, so there is a very high chance that, one of the systems that they use, that same password that they're accessing your corporate network with, can be out there on the dark web, and you really need a way to ensure that password is no longer used. So blacklisting is super key, and I think that everybody needs to kind of walk away from this with that in mind.
Okay. All right. Nick, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to those authentication assurance levels. I think Liz kind of got me thinking on this path you're mentioning. They're guidelines. They are just guidelines. It doesn't mean you must do that. And NIST well, I'm going to say it this way. I'm going to say it as nice as I can. They're not the do-all and be-all in security. It doesn't mean that they are. I mean, they are, but they're not. You know what I'm saying? Like, yes, they are, but just because they say it doesn't mean we have to do it that way. And so I think the reality is, for those in the audience, again, going back to some of the things I said kind of at the end of my discussion with Leif, is you've got to kind of assess the risk in your organization. What's at stake? What is the data you're trying to protect against being leaked? How much value does it have in the let's say customer list for a competitor or IP or whatever the case is? And you've got to kind of, based on that risk, come up with some equivalent degree of security stance in play. And while the NIST guidelines are saying you should have at least one of these factors and one of those factors, and whatever they're saying, depending on the assurance level, you're looking at, I want to go buy a solution that's going to help me. And so I think what you've got to do is look at that solution and its feature set from a standpoint of how does it alleviate risk. And then if they happen to have some materials that say we help meet authenticator assurance level 2, that's great. I mean, then you have a checkbox in your head that you know they're aligning with something that you consider a reasonable standard to be looking at. But at the same time, I don't think that needs to be your absolute defining, the base of your definition of what you should be doing as an organization. You've got to do it based off your risk and find something that meets that need.
All right. Sounds good. Makes perfect sense. Well, thank you again to both Nick Cavalancia and Liz Rivera for your presentations today. There's some great stuff we covered. And thank you to those of you in the audience for attending this webcast. And thanks to Specops Software for your sponsorship. Thanks again, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. And this concludes today's webcast.
Thanks, everyone.